The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. Have you ever walked out into the night just to escape the weight of your own thoughts? That's what she did. Mariana didn't even bother with a coat thick enough to keep the cold out. She only knew she couldn't stay in that small, dim apartment another second. Bills piled on the counter, a crib with a sleeping child in the next room, a silence so heavy it almost spoke. And so she stepped outside, letting the wind sting her cheeks, each gust feeling like both punishment and comfort. The street was nearly empty, bathed in the yellow glow of scattered lamps. The air smelled faintly of rain on old pavement, and the sound of her own footsteps kept her company. Somewhere deep inside, she hoped to hear something, anything, that might remind her she wasn't invisible to God. And then it happened, a whisper. It didn't come from behind her or from a passing stranger. It came with the wind, low and steady, carrying words she couldn't quite make out. She froze, her breath clouding in the air, straining to catch it again. Some people might call it imagination, others, coincidence. But if you've ever been desperate enough to pray without moving your lips, you know it's possible to hear God in ways that make no sense to anyone else. The wind didn't sound like comfort at first. It sounded like a call. Not loud, not urgent, just certain. It carried her feet forward toward a part of the neighborhood she rarely visited, the kind of quiet street where time felt slower. As she walked, the lights grew fewer, and the shadows stretched longer. There was a small church ahead. She'd passed it before, but never gone in. Tonight, though, the door was cracked open, warm light spilling onto the stone steps. She hesitated, not because she didn't believe in God, but because she wasn't sure she could handle another disappointment. She thought of turning away, of disappearing back into the darkness before anyone noticed her. But the wind stirred again, wrapping around her like invisible hands on her shoulders, almost guiding her toward the entrance. She didn't know it yet, but someone inside had been praying for her, without even knowing her name. And when those two lives met, nothing about the night, or their futures, would remain the same. The city was quiet, in that strange way it gets when everyone else is inside, hiding from the chill. Streetlights hummed softly, their glow pooling on the cracked pavement, making the darkness between them feel even deeper. Mariana pulled her thin sweater tighter, though it did little to keep the cold from settling into her bones. She wasn't walking with a destination in mind, just moving, because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling was dangerous tonight. The wind moved through the narrow streets like a living thing, weaving around her, brushing strands of hair across her face. It carried with it the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, and something else, something faint but warm, like the memory of fresh bread. Every few steps she thought she heard the soft echo of a voice, too low to be certain it wasn't her imagination. She stopped once, looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but the street was empty. Her mind wandered back to the apartment she had left behind, the creak of the crib when her baby shifted in sleep, the dull, blinking light of the old refrigerator, the silence of a home missing more than just a father. It was missing peace. The bills on the counter were a silent threat, each one stamped in red, like a wound that wouldn't heal. She had whispered a prayer before leaving, though it felt less like speaking to God and more like throwing words into the void. The wind came again, stronger this time, curling around her ears with that same unshakable whisper. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language she could recognize, and yet, somehow, she understood it. You are not alone. She stopped mid-step, her breath catching. She had read those words in her Bible before, but never like this. Never like someone was saying them directly to her. Ahead, the neighborhood shifted. The tall, crowded apartment buildings gave way to smaller homes, each with its own patch of overgrown yard. At the far end of the street, she saw it, a small church, humble and a little worn, its white paint dulled by years of rain and sun. The door was slightly ajar, and warm light spilled out like a quiet invitation. Mariana's first instinct was to keep walking. She didn't feel ready to face whatever waited inside, especially if it was just empty pews and the echo of her own footsteps. But the air around her seemed to change, the wind softening into something gentler, like the warm breath of a friend leaning close to tell a secret. Against every reason in her mind, she found herself moving toward the steps. She didn't know yet that someone was already there, kneeling, head bowed, praying for someone they had never met. And the moment her hand would touch that door, both their lives would start to change in ways neither of them could imagine. Mariana's shoes tapped softly against the stone steps, each one sounding louder than she expected in the stillness. She paused at the threshold, her fingers brushing against the old wooden door. The grain was rough, worn smooth in places where countless hands had pushed it open before hers. A faint creak escaped as she eased it wider, just enough to slip inside without announcing herself. The warmth that met her was almost startling after the cold outside. A mixture of candle wax, polished wood, and something floral, like lilies left too long in a vase. The small church was dim, lit mostly by a handful of candles scattered near the altar. Shadows clung to the corners, moving faintly as the flames flickered. Her eyes traveled over the rows of empty pews until they stopped on a lone figure near the front. A man, broad-shouldered but slightly hunched, was kneeling at the altar. His head was bowed, hands clasped tightly, lips moving in silent prayer. She couldn't hear the words, but his posture told her they were not casual ones. They were heavy, deliberate, pulled from somewhere deep. Mariana hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt. She slid into the last pew on the side, her knees brushing against the polished wood in front of her. The whisper of the wind was gone now, replaced by the faint creak of the church's old roof, settling in the cold. She let her eyes close for a moment, feeling the heat of the candles on her skin even from this distance. For the first time in weeks, she let her shoulders drop, just a little. Her gaze wandered back to the man at the front. Something about him seemed familiar, though she was certain they had never met. It wasn't his face, she couldn't even see it clearly. It was his presence. The same way the wind had felt alive, this man's prayer felt personal, like it was reaching past the walls of the church into the very night she had walked through. Without realizing it, Mariana's lips began to move too. She didn't speak aloud, afraid to disturb the fragile quiet, but her heart poured out in silence. God, if you're really here tonight, if that was your voice I heard out there, please don't let me leave the same. Her eyes burned, and she pressed her hands together tightly, as if holding them shut could keep the prayer from slipping away. The man shifted slightly, lifting his head. He didn't turn, but for a moment she could swear he knew she was there. His shoulders squared, his lips moved again, and she caught fragments. Protection, strength, someone in need. Her breath caught. Was he praying for her? She almost rose to leave, afraid of the weight of what she was feeling. But something inside told her to stay, to wait, to listen. The kind of whisper you don't hear with your ears, but with the space just behind your ribs. And so, she stayed, unaware that every second in that pew was pulling her closer to a conversation that would change everything. The faint creak of the door behind her made Mariana's head turn, but no one entered. It was just the wind, pushing it slightly wider, letting in a sliver of cold air that curled through the church and made the candles flicker. She shivered, pulling her sweater closer, yet she couldn't help feeling that the open door wasn't an accident. It was as if the night itself wanted to be part of whatever was happening here. The man at the altar finally rose to his feet. He didn't turn right away. Instead, resting his hands on the wooden rail, his head bowed in a final, silent sentence of prayer. When he did turn, his eyes met hers instantly, not with surprise, but with recognition, as though he had been expecting her. His gaze was steady, calm, and so direct that she felt the urge to look away, but she didn't. Something in her refused to break that connection. He walked slowly down the aisle toward her, his footsteps measured, almost hesitant. Mariana's pulse quickened. She could leave, slip past him, out the half-open door, and pretend this night never happened. Yet her body didn't move. She stayed seated, her hands clenched together, as though waiting for him was the only choice she could make. When he reached the pew, he didn't sit. He stood just beside it, his voice low and warm, the kind that carried even in a whisper. "I've been praying for someone tonight," he said. "I didn't know who, until now." The words landed heavy in the quiet. Mariana blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. She searched his face for any hint of pity, but there was none, only sincerity. "Why?" she asked, her voice more fragile than she intended. He smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with something that felt like understanding. "Because God put it in my heart. I just didn't realize he'd bring you here." The door behind them groaned again, swaying in the wind, as if to underline his words. Mariana's chest tightened. The night outside felt far away now, as though stepping back through that door would mean returning to a world that hadn't changed. While here, in this dim, candle-lit space, change felt possible. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he had been on his knees for a stranger. But deep inside, she knew the moment she walked in and saw him, this was not random. Something had guided her here, and the thought both frightened and comforted her all at once. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind brushing against the church walls filled the space between them, soft but persistent, as if it refused to be left out of this conversation. The man shifted slightly, leaning on the back of the pew in front of her, his eyes still locked on hers. "What's your name?" he asked gently. It was such a simple question, yet it felt impossibly heavy. "Mariana," she answered, her voice low but steady. Saying it aloud here, in this place, felt different, almost like an introduction not just to him, but to something greater. His expression softened, as though the name had already been part of his prayer. "Mariana," he repeated like a vow. "I asked God to send someone who needed to be reminded they're not forgotten." Her throat tightened. She wanted to deflect, to laugh it off, to say he had the wrong person. But the truth was, she had been feeling invisible for weeks, maybe months. She glanced toward the altar, where the candles burned in slow, unwavering silence, and wondered if they had been witnesses to more prayers like his, quiet, desperate, and yet certain. He didn't sit beside her. Instead, he stepped toward the center aisle, his hand brushing the smooth edge of the pew as he walked forward. "I prayed for protection," he said, "for someone out there tonight who might be walking through the cold, with more than just the weather weighing them down." His voice didn't rise, but each word carried the kind of conviction that leaves no room for doubt. Mariana followed him with her eyes, her heart beating unevenly. The way he spoke, it wasn't the kind of polished language you hear in sermons. It was personal, lived, like he'd walked through his own nights of wind and silence, and somehow still believed enough to pray for a stranger. She found herself leaning forward, not wanting to miss a single word. He stopped at the front again, turning toward her, the candles casting warm shadows across his face. "I didn't know who you were, or where you were, but I think God did, and he brought you here tonight, for a reason." The words hung in the air, not demanding a response, but offering one if she was willing. Outside, the half-open door moved again, and a gust swept through, making her hair lift slightly off her shoulders. She could have sworn she heard it, the faintest echo of that whisper from the street. "You are not alone." And for the first time in a long while, she didn't doubt it. Mariana's hands rested on her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She could feel the heat from the candles even at this distance, a warmth that contrasted with the cold ache still clinging to her skin from the walk here. The man, still nameless to her, remained near the altar, silent now, as if giving her room to breathe. That quiet stretched between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she could cross. Her eyes dropped to the worn wood of the pew, its surface smoothed by years of people leaning forward in prayer. She traced a faint groove with her thumb, wondering how many tears had fallen here, how many whispered confessions and desperate pleas had soaked into the silence of this room. Without warning, her own eyes began to blur, the first tear slipping free before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, but another followed and another. She hated crying in front of people, especially strangers. But something about this space, about the way the wind had carried her here and the way his eyes had met hers without pity, made it impossible to keep the walls up. A quiet sob escaped her, muffled behind the back of her hand. The sound seemed to pull him closer, his footsteps soft but certain as he walked down the aisle toward her. He didn't sit beside her at first. Instead, he knelt in the aisle, bringing himself level with her eyes. "You don't have to explain," he said softly, his voice the kind that didn't need to rise above a whisper to be heard. Sometimes, the heart says enough without words. The kindness in his tone made the tears come harder, and she turned slightly away, embarrassed. But he didn't press. He simply placed a small, folded handkerchief on the edge of the pew and stepped back, giving her space again. She picked it up, the fabric warm from his hand, and pressed it to her face. For a moment, the smell of laundry soap and something faintly herbal, like chamomile, filled her senses. It was such a small thing, but it grounded her in the present, reminding her she was here now and not trapped in the spiral of her thoughts. When she finally lowered the handkerchief, her breathing slower, he was seated quietly at the far end of the pew, not staring, not waiting for her to speak, just there. And that somehow was exactly what she needed. The wind outside had grown quieter, but in her chest, something else was stirring, something like the very beginning of peace. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It felt like a pause that invited breath. Mariana sat with the handkerchief in her lap, turning the fabric over in her fingers as if it might hold answers she hadn't yet formed into questions. The man glanced toward the small table near the side wall, where a tray sat with a plain white teapot, a few mismatched mugs, and a basket covered with a cloth. He rose without a word and walked toward it, the wooden floor creaking softly under his steps. She watched as he lifted the cloth, revealing several small loaves of bread, their crusts golden and uneven, clearly homemade. The aroma reached her almost instantly, warm, yeasty, with the faint sweetness of honey. He poured steaming coffee into 2 mugs, the rich scent mingling with the bread and chasing away the lingering chill from the door. When he turned, he wasn't in a hurry. He carried the tray as though it mattered to him that it arrived intact, that nothing spilled, that it was offered with care. Setting the tray on the pew between them, he gestured toward it. "Eat," he said gently. "It's still warm." Mariana hesitated, unsure if she should accept, but the truth was she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten something made by hand. She tore off a small piece, the crust crackling softly, and brought it to her mouth. The bread was still soft inside, the heat curling against her tongue. It tasted safe. The coffee was strong, slightly bitter, but in a way that felt grounding. Each sip seemed to warm more than just her body. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice almost lost under the low hum of the wind outside. He only nodded, his eyes briefly meeting hers before looking away, as if to remind her that this moment was free of pressure, just two people sharing bread and warmth. For a while they ate in silence, the simple act of breaking bread becoming its own quiet language. Mariana felt her mind begin to slow, her chest loosen. The pew that had felt like a barrier earlier now felt like a shelter. She glanced toward the altar, the candles still burning low, and realized that for the first time in days, she wasn't thinking about the bills, the loneliness, or the questions that had no answers. When the last crumbs were gone, he set the tray aside and leaned back slightly. "Sometimes," he said, his voice soft, "God answers before we even ask. We just don't recognize it until we taste it." His words weren't meant to be clever. They were simple, almost like the bread, plain on the surface but carrying something deeper the longer they lingered. Mariana didn't reply, but the truth of it settled inside her like the last sip of coffee, warm and steady. The coffee mug sat empty now, the faint steam having long disappeared, but neither Mariana nor the man seemed in a rush to move. The quiet between them had shifted. It wasn't the fragile, hesitant kind anymore. It was the stillness that comes when two people begin to trust the space they share. He rested his elbows lightly on his knees, his fingers loosely interlaced, and glanced at her as if weighing whether to speak. "My name is Daniel," he said finally. His voice was calm, without the formality of introductions, as though the name was simply another piece of bread placed on the table between them. Mariana nodded slightly, holding it in her mind, letting the name take shape alongside his presence. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight," he continued, "but sometimes the plans we think we make are just detours to the ones God has already written." His words settled over her like the candlelight, soft, warm, persistent. She didn't know why, but it felt safe enough to let some of her own truth surface. "I left my apartment because I couldn't breathe in there anymore," she admitted, her voice low, as if afraid the confession might echo too loudly. "It felt like the walls were closing in, and I didn't know where else to go." Daniel didn't flinch, didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. "Sometimes the place we run to isn't as important as the reason we keep moving," he said. "Maybe you weren't running away tonight. Maybe you were being led." The simplicity of the statement sent a shiver through her. Not the cold kind, but the kind that comes when truth brushes close enough to touch. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment she thought of the whisper she'd heard outside, the words carried on the wind that had made her stop in her tracks. "You are not alone." It was strange. She'd wanted proof of God's presence for weeks, and now that she was here, she didn't know how to hold it. "I don't know if I believe that anymore," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Daniel's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. "That's all right," he replied. "Belief doesn't disappear just because we can't feel it. Sometimes it's just buried under the noise, and all it takes is the right moment, the right voice, to bring it back." The words wrapped around her like the wind had earlier, gentle, insistent, impossible to ignore. She didn't answer, but a single tear slid down her cheek, and this time she didn't wipe it away. The air inside the church felt different now, as though something invisible had shifted. Mariana sat back slightly, her palms resting against the smooth wood of the pew, feeling the grain beneath her fingertips. The steady flicker of the candles cast soft shadows along the walls, and the faint scent of bread still lingered, mingling with the cool trace of wind that slipped through the half-open door. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this, present. Daniel leaned against the pew in front of him, not in a way that suggested distance, but as if anchoring himself to the moment. "You know," he said, "faith doesn't always return in one sudden burst." Sometimes it starts like the first breath after crying, small, quiet, but real. His words carried the calm weight of someone who had been where she was now, and had found a way through. Mariana looked toward the altar, the rows of candles standing tall and unwavering despite the occasional draft. She thought about the wind that had carried her here, about the whisper she'd heard in the cold, about sitting in this pew with bread still warm in her hands. And slowly, the disbelief that had wrapped around her heart began to loosen, like frost melting under sunlight. She didn't speak, but Daniel seemed to sense the change. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn Bible, its edges frayed from years of use. Without moving closer, he opened it and began to read, not loudly, but in a voice that carried to her without breaking the stillness. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. The verse hung in the air, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment to be spoken. Her eyes closed. The words seemed to echo in the quiet places of her mind where fear had been living. You need only to be still. How long had it been since she'd stopped running in her thoughts? Since she'd allowed herself to believe someone else, someone greater, might still be fighting for her? When she opened her eyes, Daniel was watching her, not with expectation, but with a patient steadiness. "Faith isn't about feeling strong all the time," he said. "Sometimes it's just about showing up, even when you don't know why." A slow breath escaped her lips, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel heavy. She didn't declare anything out loud. She didn't promise God she'd never doubt again. But somewhere inside, a small ember of belief flickered back to life, and even though it was fragile, it was warm. The night outside had deepened, the faint hum of the city now replaced by the sharper sound of wind pressing against the church wall. A subtle chill crept through the half-open door, curling around the pews, but inside, the warmth from the candles and the lingering scent of bread still made the space feel like a refuge. Mariana sat in a quiet stillness she hadn't known for months, her hands resting loosely on her lap. Daniel remained near the altar, his Bible closed now, fingers drumming lightly on its worn cover. His eyes lifted to the small cross that hung above the candles, and a faint smile crossed his face. Not the kind born from happiness alone, but from recognition. "Sometimes," he said, his voice steady, "the miracle isn't in the answer we're asking for, but in the way God changes our heart while we wait." Mariana let the words settle. She thought about the heaviness that had followed her for so long and how, for reasons she couldn't explain, it didn't feel as crushing now. It wasn't that her problems had vanished. She still had bills, still had questions about tomorrow. But something inside her had shifted, and that shift felt like a gift she hadn't expected. Then, something small but almost startling happened. From somewhere near the back of the church, the door gave a gentle knock as the wind pushed harder and the hinges groaned. Mariana turned instinctively, but there was no one there, only the sound of the wind rushing in, carrying with it a faint aroma of rain. She realized, with a strange certainty, that this was the same wind from earlier, the one that had whispered to her in the street. Only now, it didn't feel like a summons. It felt like confirmation. Daniel noticed her glance toward the door and nodded slowly, as if he understood without her speaking. "When God speaks, it's not always to tell us to move," he said. "Sometimes it's to let us know he's still here." The truth in those words made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with the kind of awe that humbles you. The wind eased, but the quiet it left behind wasn't empty. It was charged, alive, as though the air itself was waiting. Mariana realized something. She had come here expecting nothing, not even answers, but she was leaving with something she hadn't dared to hope for. And yet, she didn't rise to go. Some part of her knew the night wasn't finished, that there was one more thing meant to happen before she stepped back into the world outside. She didn't know what it would be, but the way Daniel's eyes met hers then, steady, unwavering, told her he might. The candles were burning low now, their flames smaller, but no less steady. The shadows along the walls seemed softer, less like looming shapes and more like the folds of a blanket wrapping the room. Mariana sat in the same pew, but it felt different, less like a place she had stumbled into and more like a place she had been led to all along. Daniel stood near the altar, his voice low but sure. "Mariana," he said, pausing as if to weigh the words before releasing them. "God doesn't just speak once. His voice, it lingers. It follows you even when you think you've stopped listening." She felt the truth of it in the quiet beat of her own heart, in the memory of the wind carrying those words through the cold. You are not alone. She rose slowly, her legs a little unsteady, not from weakness but from the weight of the moment. As she walked toward the door, Daniel didn't follow immediately. Instead, he remained where he was, his eyes lowered in silent prayer. She knew he wasn't praying for himself. He was praying for her, for the days she hadn't lived yet, for the moments when doubt might try to drown out this night's certainty. At the doorway, she paused. The wind met her again, cool against her skin, but not biting. It carried the scent of rain and distant earth, and beneath it, something that felt impossibly familiar, like the warmth of bread and the sound of a kind voice. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she prayed without forcing the words. They came on their own, as naturally as breathing. When she opened her eyes, Daniel was standing a few steps back, his face calm, his presence steady. He didn't need to say anything more. The silence between them was no longer a gap to fill, but a thread that connected them. She gave him a small nod, and he returned it, as if sealing a quiet agreement neither needed to explain. Stepping out into the night, the street felt less empty, the darkness less heavy. The wind moved alongside her, not ahead, not behind, just there. And though the world outside was the same as when she had entered, she was not. That whisper she had heard hours ago was still with her, not fading with the distance, but settling deeper inside, where it would not be forgotten. You are not alone. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Isaiah 41:10.